Well, hello. This is Joseph from English with Joseph. Good day to you. Today I have a very special request from someone. Yes, someone wrote to me and asked if I would talk a little bit about Scotland. You know from my accent that I'm Scottish, and I was asked if I would speak about legend and myth, things like fairies and superstitions from Scotland. A legend is something which is much bigger than it appears to be. It's something so big that it's actually unreal. Let me give you an example. If we think of the Beatles, the pop group, you could say, wow, they are legends. If you think of ABBA, you can say, whoa, they are legends. So it's used a lot in the entertainment circle to show someone who is very, very famous. Okay, wow, they are legends. Sometimes at work, my colleagues may say to one another, wow, you're a legend because you're able to get something done. A legend is a story which is so famous that it goes ahead of itself. So if a person is a legend, then that means that everyone's talking about that person, everyone knows. But the actual word comes from a slightly different meaning. And a legend, when it comes to fairy tales and ghosts and things like that, means something which doesn't actually exist, but it's something which everyone is talking about. Let me give you an example. Fairies in Scotland. Well, they're a legend because they don't really exist, but everyone talks about them, Another way of saying this is an urban myth. An urban myth can be something which isn't real, but everyone thinks it is because everyone talks about it so much that it becomes real. Fairies, on the other hand, are a little bit different because everyone kind of knows that they're not real. Okay, so to summarize then, a legend is a story which is so famous everyone's heard of it. Okay, but it isn't really true. A person who's a legend is so famous everyone's talking about him because of the lovely way that he sings, but probably it's not really true. It's just his reputation is greater than him. An urban myth is the same. An urban myth is something that everyone believes is true, but really isn't. So it's kind of complex. But anyway, someone wanted me today to talk about legends of Scotland. Now, I'm not quite sure what they really want to know, but there are some things I can tell you about legends from Scotland. One of the first things I can tell you is that in the old days in Scotland, it was very, very common to believe in fairies and ghosts. It was a psychological way for people to explain things which they couldn't understand. Let me explain. Imagine you have a child and the child dies. To say, oh, a fairy must have came and killed the child is much easier to explain than wondering, well, why did my child die? So in those days, everything was given to superstition. Everything that couldn't be explained belonged to the supernatural world, So in Scotland, many, many years ago, and I'm speaking maybe 300, 400, 500 years ago, there was a great belief in fairies. And the people spoke Gaelic, which is the language of Scotland. In the old days, these fairies some of them were called Banshee, and that's Gaelic, okay. And they used to be big people. These fairies were not small fairies with wings. These fairies were waiting for you at the end of the road to take your money and to beat you up and to hit you. And when someone went for a walk in the evening, if they were attacked, if they fell, always it was the problem and the fault of the fairies. Everything was explained by the fairies. The Banshee had a particular role in the fairy world because she would come when someone was dying. Okay, she could come either as a very young, beautiful woman who would be combing her hair and crying loudly, or she would come as an old hag, an old witch, who would be crying bitterly. And it is said that the Banshee would be a distant relative, perhaps an ancestor of the family. And some people also said, well, actually the Banshee was a fairy given to the family many years ago. But whoever she was, she would come and you would hear her crying. Even my grandmother, who lived until the 1990s, believed in banshees. And it's very interesting how the belief in fairies used to sit alongside the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church doesn't believe in anything like that. So the banshee was one type of fairy which would be seen outside the window. She would be young with blonde hair, combing her hair and crying, or she would be an old witch. Another type of Scottish superstition was the monsters. Everyone's heard of the Loch Ness Monster from Scotland. Well, actually, every loch had one, not just Loch Ness. Everywhere had a monster. And the reason why Loch Ness became so famous is because it's one of the deepest lochs, and people actually claim to have seen Nessie. So as you can imagine, people would go out drunk, for example, and fall over a rock and hit their head, and they'd have to blame it on something. So perhaps it was the fault of a fairy, and it would be a really good story if you also got to see the monster, you know? So that's two examples of the way that superstition is used in Scotland. There's many other types of fairy as well, but the idea was that they would live in small mountains, like a small enclosure. Usually in Scotland, the Stone Age people, they had built mounds to bury people in. So in the Scottish countryside, often you would come across something that wasn't as big as a mountain, but it was something you could walk up to the top of. It was like just a massive cave in the middle of the countryside, all covered in grass. So it looks just like a little mountain, but there's something strange about it because they always look man-made. And these things, which were left by our Stone Age ancestors, in medieval times they became known as fairy mounds, because that's where the fairies lived. Now, to understand about the Scottish mind at that time, you have to understand a bit about the culture. It was very barren, very quiet. There was nothing for people to do. So if you went out in the evening time and you met someone you didn't know, you would assume it was a fairy. If they hit you, it was definitely a fairy. If they robbed you, yep, it was a fairy. And if you had been drinking so that you didn't remember what happened, perhaps the fairy took you away to his or her place. And when the fairy would take you away to his or her mound, they would take you inside and you would be forced to dance. You would dance to Scottish music and you wouldn't be able to stop. The only way you could stop is if a friend creeped in, grabbed you and pulled you out. Now, if you can imagine, if someone is drunk, that's a pretty good excuse. Where were you last night? Oh, I don't know. And this is where the term away with the fairies came from. In Scotland, it's very common for people to say, him? Oh, he's away with the fairies, meaning he's crazy, that the fairies have taken him. But this was a common belief that the fairies could come and kidnap you. Now, there's a few interesting things about the fairies. One is the fact that they were terrified of metal. If you had a metal key or a lock, the fairies stayed away from you. Okay. That probably got some reference to the people's minds when they knew that the age of iron was coming, the Industrial Revolution, which would be laying railroad tracks and modernising society. That would explain their fear of it and how they projected it into their daily lives. Another thing about fairies is their ability to kidnap children. Now, if a child is born and was disabled, it means that the fairies came and they basically swapped the child for a fairy child. Okay. And that would explain the disability. Another thing would be if a woman was out walking and she had to cross some water and she had a disabled child with her, she could say, oh well, I want my own child back that the fairies has taken, and she will throw the child in the water, the child will float off, and the next thing another child appears. That's the story. But in that story, clearly what's happened is she's killed one child and she's immediately given birth to another. And of course in those days when sex could only happen inside marriage, you can understand why it would be easier to explain the fairies returning a child than to say, oh, I've just given birth to a second child, if there was no father. There's many other stories like this. There's another one that I remember about the horse. Fairies could take the shape of a horse, and if you got on the horse, you couldn't get back off it, and the horse would run into the sea, and you would never be seen again, and your liver would be washed up on the shore. Now, that's obviously one way of explaining someone who's fallen into the water, probably drunk, or one way of explaining how somebody just drowned in a storm, maybe. There's other ones of animals where the fairy pretends to be a vicious dog and won't let you pass, you know. And the way to appease the fairies is to strike up a deal with them, offer them porridge, something which they liked. And you also could get fairies to do work for you. There's stories of workmen who would go home in the evening, come back the next day and find all their work done or all their work disrupted. This was blamed on fairies. Now, of course, this is all about labour and paying people, you know. There's all kinds of logical explanations, but it's so interesting the way these people were able to project onto the landscape and into their lives this supernatural force which helped them to explain things that they couldn't explain. It's also very interesting that they didn't make it an act of God, that they actually felt that there were these people who were helping them. Some of these fairies actually became very, very famous. There's a few very famous Scottish families who claimed that they met their banshee and they met their fairy, and how she stayed and helped them and granted them wishes all throughout her life. But there's also stories of families who've been walking around Scotland who would come across someone with a disfigured nose, probably due to leprosy or malnutrition, something like that. And immediately they would be called fairies, and they would be up to no good because you couldn't or you should not trust the fairy. It's very similar to the jinn in Islam and in the Arab world, although the fairies were not necessarily Christian. I mean, holding up a cross to protect yourself from the fairies didn't make a lot of difference. Okay, so it wasn't like they were terrified of God. In fact, they seemed to live alongside humanity. But it was indeed just humanity's way of explaining certain things which was happening in life. Well, I hope that gives you an introduction to Scottish folklore, myth, and legend. And let me know if you would like to know some more. Any requests, just send me a comment. Thank you.